do you trust the Italian stallion to bring out the best in Nabers?
I tried to tell you guys over the summertime, there were dozens of us talking about Will Dissly and his potential as a top 12. Dozens of us.
It is tougher for him to have those very high-end wide receiver one outcomes.
As a long time, just sad, pained, depressed Cowboys fan, you've had to watch a lot of running backs just have field days against this defense. Hello and welcome to the Fantasy Life Show. Happy Wednesday, everybody. I'm your host, Ian Hartitz. It is a great day to be great, and it's a great day to break down some of the biggest questions, mismatches, and all that jazz ahead of Week 12. But I cannot accomplish that feat alone, and accordingly, I'm once again joined by the great Chris Allen, as well as Dwain, the Rock McFarland. Dwain, I thought, we've spent a lot of years together at this point, and when you tell me that you're going to rank Jauan Jennings ahead of Deebo Samuel, and then you don't actually do it, what are we doing here, man?
Yeah, man, I just had to do that to see if you were actually looking at my ranks. I did move Jauan Jennings way up the ranks, and to be fair, yesterday I said, hey, guys, it's just really more about you can't count Jauan Jennings out, can't count Deebo out, can't count Kittle out. They're all going to have their big weeks, so look, I like all three players.
Chris, you are quickly rising up the ranks of my favorite co-hosts after this just insulting behavior. But, how's it going, my friend?
I'm doing well. I don't know. I think Dwain does have a point. We have to like all of the 49ers pass catchers. I won't. We shouldn't slander the man too much. Come on. They paid both of them fairly well. And let's also take into context the injuries that have happened to Deebo. But other than that, I mean, I'm doing quite well. Happy to dive into all the news and stuff that's going on, even though really not a lot, really.
If you're not getting pissed off at rather meaningless rankings because we're starting both guys anyway, then you're not doing Week 12 right in fantasy football land, in my opinion. But Chris did mention it. I was saying before the show got started, probably the lightest news day we've seen this season happened on Tuesday, but we did at least get one quote-unquote bombshell earlier in the day. The Jets went ahead and fired their general manager, Joe Douglas, pretty much completely cleaning house at this point after Robert Saleh was obviously let go earlier in the season as well. So, Dwain, I mean, at this point, do you even think Aaron Rodgers is going to be the starting quarterback for the New York Jets in 2025?
I mean, I think it's up in the air. Like if there's ever a time that you can just not have to worry about sunk cost fallacy, right? You get a whole new leadership team. They could be very willing to move away from Aaron Rodgers. Like when I watch Rodgers play, and look, I'm not like this film guru on quarterbacks. Like to me, he can still make all the throws and everything, Ian, but I do think some of it comes down to what's up in the locker room. What does it mean for Aaron Rodgers to be on this team? What direction do the Jets want to be headed on? Like, I mean, we're talking about a team that just look over the last few drafts, right? Added Sauce Gardner. I know he's had a little bit of a rough season, but Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall, they have a lot of really good young players that they can still build around. Aaron Rodgers, obviously not one of those. But we also did see the Zach Wilson experiment. I know all the fun, tweets and everything going around about how it hadn't even really been any different. But guys, Aaron Rodgers has been better than Zach Wilson. I know the results have not necessarily been different for the two quarterbacks. I think it really just comes down to culture, man. I think it comes down to what the new leadership team thinks about Aaron Rodgers in the locker room. Do they want him leading their team? Because I don't know, man. It's a little bit of a negative vibe, in my opinion. Like, I feel like there's some negative vibes going on. So they may decide they want to move on. And look, they have all their picks. So they're out from under everything. I know they gave away a pick that could turn into a second for Davante Adams. I think for AFC Championship game, not happening. I think if he's an all-pro, I think it also turns into a second-round pick. So, I don't know. Maybe they don't play Davante Adams as much down the stretch because he has been earning his targets.
I wanted to come here with a funny stat about how the offenses have been identical with Zach Wilson versus Rodgers. But Dwayne, you're right, they haven't. I mean, they've scored 39 more points over the course of their first 11 games than they did last season. If anything, it's the defense that's fallen apart. I mean, over these past 5 weeks, they've allowed 37, 25. Good effort, only giving up 13 to Texans, but then 31 and 28 over these past 5 weeks. Again, fifth most points allowed in the NFL since week 7. So, Chris, I think we can all agree we haven't seen vintage prime Aaron Rodgers out there, but I'm not exactly sure there's a good veteran quarterback waiting out in free agency that's necessarily going to approve him. I guess they really are looking at a total reset.
It seems that way, and from some of the reporting we've seen over the past day or so, it looked like owner Woody Johnson was trying to move things in that direction earlier in the season. I think it was Zach Rosenblatt, and also Diana Rossini from The Athletic were reporting that Johnson wanted to bench Aaron Rodgers earlier in the season after their loss to Denver. I think it was around the week 4 timeframe. So if they were looking at trying to mash the reset button that early on, and now the vibes have gotten to the point where they're trying to make this unceremonious firing of their GM. Because really, guys, what does a GM do at this point in the season past the trade deadline? I'm honestly asking this because do they really need to get rid of their GM at this point, like this so late in the season after the trade deadline? Didn't make a ton of sense to me, but I'm with both of you that now we're looking at a potential Jets roster where we don't have any sort of stability at the quarterback position. And for Aaron Rodgers specifically, despite the fact that he was coming back from the Achilles injury and we saw Kirk Cousins do the same thing, maybe Aaron Rodgers should have gone the Kirko Chains route and just started wearing chains and having all these dad jokes about him, like using Cole's cash and all that. Maybe that would have improved the vibes and we would have seen a bit more out of the Jets quarterback.
I mean, the wildest thing about all this is, according to Jordan Schultz, while Joe Douglas did hold the GM title, obviously, until yesterday, Schultz was told that much of the organization had actually been overseen by higher-ups over the past month. So it doesn't even sound like he's been pulling the strings for the better part of the last, 4 to 6 weeks. Yet he is sadly, not really sadly, I'm sure that buyout is absolutely fantastic, as are, all the fired coaches around the league. But yeah, never good to see the job lost. So overall, guys, among 35 qualified quarterbacks this year, Roger, 21st in EPA per dropback, sandwiched between Geno Smith and CJ Stroud, just 31st in terms of completion percentage over expected, also right in front of CJ Stroud. So my takeaway was CJ Stroud maybe having a bit rougher season than the mainstream media is letting on. Obviously, plenty of injuries have contributed to that. But anyway, Jets are on a bye. I'm sure we'll have more to talk about them in week 13 and beyond. Only other major news items from yesterday, guys, was essentially just a Mike McCarthy press conference. And the fact that the Cowboys cannot get a handle on the glare, even coming into the press conferences, just incredible, malpractice from an organization that obviously not having the season go the way they wanted. But anyway, McCarthy did note that Cooper Rush will again be the starter this week, but there will be a package for Trey Lance. Also said Brandon Cooks is hopeful to return this week from a knee injury that's had him on IR for the better part of the last month and a half. And also Jake Ferguson with that concussion, he'll be hard pressed to play per McCarthy ahead of week 12. So not ideal in Dallas, and yeah, not ideal, looking forward for Mike McCarthy's job security either. So that was the news, everyone. And now a quick word to our friends over at DraftKings. A chill in the air, leaves falling to the ground, and football every weekend. That is what fall is all about, and you can make each weekend even more exciting by getting into the action with our partners at DraftKings, the #1 place to bet on touchdowns. And right now, all new customers who bet just $5 will instantly get $200 in bonus bets. All you have to do is download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and sign up using our promo code FANTASYLIFE. The crown is yours. Again, that's $200 in bonus bets instantly, and you can stay in on the action and use your $200 in bonus bets to bet anytime touchdowns on DraftKings. After all, DraftKings is the place to bet touchdowns. If sports betting is not yet available in your state, don't worry. You can still join in on all the fun with DraftKings Daily Fantasy and have the shot to win cash prizes. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. New customers use our promo code FANTASYLIFE and bet just $5 on any wager to get $200 in bonus bets instantly. That's promo code FANTASYLIFE only at DraftKings Sportsbook. It is Wednesday, fellas, which means it is time to throw some shade. I got my Titans knock-around sunglasses on because I think they're nice, man. I think the Titans should make more of a habit of wearing those Houston Oilers baby blue colors. I mean, your season's already in the gutter. Why not at least look good while you're doing it? Dwayne's rocking some more regular shades, as is the great Chris Allen. So, fellas, we're going to throw some shade, potentially more of a shade or not segment, if you will, as some wide receiver ones forced to play with backup QBs, because there are 3 big ones who normally are just staples in our starting lineups. But again, when you subtract that ever important starting QB, a bit tougher to be overly optimistic about the wide receivers involved. So Dwain, going to start things off with your Dallas Cowboys. CeeDee Lamb with Cooper Rush. We've kind of seen him have one dud, one bigger game last week. What are you looking at CeeDee in rankings land ahead of week 12?
Yeah, I'm going to have him where I had him last week. I have him right there as that borderline wide receiver 1. Obviously, we've got a lot of teams on bye this week, so he's a tad higher than that. Look, we saw what can happen with, Cooper Rush. Like, we all watched the game. Like, how many real NFL throws did he make in that game? Maybe 2 or 3. The deep out to CeeDee Lamb was a good throw, but most of it was just all little dump offs underneath to the tight ends. You happen to hit a quick slant to Javonte Turpin, which gave you, a nice stat line at the end of the day. But we know that Cooper Rush, more of a 200, 220 yard per game kind of guy. Lamb's still earning his targets, Ian, so he's not going to completely fall out of the wide receiver 1 conversation. But it is tougher for him to have those very high-end wide receiver 1 outcomes. It is really interesting, though, because we're going to be talking about 2 wide receivers in this segment, with CeeDee Lamb being one of them, that really has a great schedule the rest of the way. I mean, the Dallas Cowboys have one of the top 3 schedules the rest of the way for quarterback and wide receivers. So CeeDee Lamb's still going to do his damage. It's just that before, you would have been thinking, man, Lamb's probably the wide receiver 1 the rest of the season. Now you're thinking, man, maybe he could be wide receiver 10 the rest of the way.
I will say, Chris, you can talk about Cooper Rush not exactly being good at throwing the football, which is a problem given he is a professional quarterback, but he has been good at feeding his number 1 wide receiver. In his 8 career starts now, CeeDee Lamb does have at least 8 targets in each and every game. And don't look now, but the Cowboys do continue to feature CeeDee on the ground. 12 carries into 68 yards this season. That is more than any wide receiver not named Jaden Reed or Deebo Samuel. So again, Chris, we all agree Cooper Rush, not a big fan of him being under center, but it seems like with CeeDee still getting that wide receiver 1 level volume, which at worst still leaves him as a comfortable wide receiver 2 in fantasy land.
I think that's fair. And this goes to, I think, something, Dwayne, you've noted a number of times throughout this season of wide receiver utility is really the combination of talent and situation. And talent, earning targets, is also a talent that so many few wide receivers have. And wide receivers, especially in CeeDee Lamb's range, where you're getting 30% of the team's targets, which CeeDee Lamb has been around there over the past couple of weeks with Cooper Rush being under center. That's where we see CeeDee actually adding to, or being able to be that wide receiver that he's second to be. But the situation, that's the thing that's dropped down over the past couple of weeks. The Dallas Cowboys have been at bottom 5, bottom 6, and pretty much every offensive efficiency metric: yards per drive, EPA per play, explosive play rate, all of that, which brings down his ceiling. It caps his ceiling. But with Washington, the Giants, my Bengals being on their upcoming schedule, CeeDee Lamb falls from that high-end wide receiver 1, that top 3, top 6 type wide receiver you would want, back into the, let's say, lower end scale of things. So still have him in your roster, still think he's going to get the volume to wind up being in the wide receiver 2 range, but that ceiling outcome for him, it's hard to see moving forward.
Certainly some shade at Cooper Rush, but not so much CeeDee Lamb. Honestly, I think the Cowboys as a team could use some knockarounds. Again, just really all facets of their life dealing with that sun down there in Dallas. Let's talk about another NFC East squad. Again, moving on to their backup quarterback, presumably just for financial reasons. Actually have some reports about the players not too happy about the move. But yes, it is Tommy DeVito's season with the Giants. And accordingly, Dwayne, we got to be concerned about Malik Nabers. But man, I'm looking at it right now. First 4 weeks of the year, Malik Nabers, wide receiver 32, wide receiver 3, 4, and 6, has a concussion. Since coming back, Dwayne has not finished better than the wide receiver 23, man, in 4 straight weeks. Do you trust the Italian Stallion to bring out the best in Nabers?
I love that. The Italian Stallion. I'm here for Tommy Cutlets. I'm here for the support. So here's what I'll say. You just talked about how good Malik Nabers was early in the year. Daniel Jones, week 1, 186 passing yards. Didn't matter. Malik Nabers was still good. Week 2, 178 passing yards. Malik Nabers was still good. Then 236, 281, 257. Got on a little bit of a roll. But really, if you look at these last several games, it's been back down, below. So I think it's a slight downgrade, potentially, moving from Daniel Jones over to DeVito, but I don't think it's as much of a downgrade as we have moving from a guy like Dak Prescott, who we've seen have a weekly upside of being able to throw for 300 yards, to a guy like Cooper Rush, who we're expecting 200. Right now, we have the data on here on the screen. You guys can all see it here for yourself, but fantasy points per game, 34.7 with Daniel Jones in 2024 for the wide receivers, 26.6 for DeVito in 2023, but that's without Malik Nabers. So that's a big difference, right? And the one thing I'll say here with Malik Nabers, the other thing that I did is I actually went back and just compared, what those two looked like last year. So looking at, Daniel Jones versus DeVito. And so in the games where DeVito played at least 80% of the snaps, because there was one game in there where he only played 50%, 172 yards and 1 touchdown per game in the games where he played at least 80% of the snaps. If you go back and you look at Daniel Jones, he was only slightly better than that last year, 191. So both of those guys in a Malik neighborless offense last year, they weren't very good, but it isn't as big of a downgrade as what we saw from Prescott to Rush. So I'm a little less worried about this one, but ultimately they both rank in the same range for me, Ian. I mean, it's been a problem for Malik Nabers over the last 4 games. His utilization score is a 7.9 versus his 9.0 on the season. Here are Malik Nabers' wide receiver finishes. You mentioned since the concussion, wide receiver 34, 26, 22, 24. So he's a mid-range wide receiver 2 for me moving forward, so slightly below CeeDee Lamb.
I'm not going to lie. My initial rankings had Nabers up there, wide receiver 6. Chris, that was way too high. I'm going to have to downgrade him a little bit. He is a mid-tier wide receiver, too. It's
great
Tommy
matchup.
Cutlets, fun time, fun matchup. But come on, we're still talking about the Giants offense here.
Right. And with Tommy DeVito averaging around $170 in passing yards per game, and that was in his around 4 starts or so last season, you have to downgrade both the situation for Nabers. And to Dwain's point, without seeing a similar output to where Nabers was at in the earlier parts of the season before his concussion, I mean, outside of the schedule looking somewhat favorable for him, I get the Bucs this week, but then Dallas, New Orleans, and the Ravens afterwards. I mean, 3 secondaries that you would want to target from a wide receiver standpoint. I mean, Nabers, in the wide receiver 2 conversation, at least for the moment. Let's see if maybe Tommy DeVito brings a little bit more to the table, but other than Cutlets, I really can't expect much from Tommy DeVito.
We got Brian Dable calling plays this year. I do think it's a slightly better situation. And to Dwayne's point, we really did see Cutlets play about as well as Jones last season. Still those guys among 46 qualified quarterbacks. Tommy DeVito ranks 44th in EPA per dropback and just 41st in completion percentage over expected. Also, the worst QB in terms of letting pressures be converted to sacks. So please, man, just get rid of that football. And it'd be really cool if you just happen to throw it to you, the number 6 overall pick, more dropbacks than not. Last one, folks. Let's talk about some Indianapolis Colts, because Josh Downs has had some booms when we've had Anthony Richardson under center, performances with 20.9 PPR points and 19.4, but also Dwain, some truly rough lows, 5.2 and 1.3 fantasy point performances to his name. So we saw a nice one last week. Do you expect the good times to keep on rolling now that Richardson is presumably under center the rest of the season?
He's just so much more of a boom bust play with Richardson, right? You're so much more likely to get the 2-pointer. You could still get the upside of the 25-pointer. With Joe Flacco under center, it's like basically lock in 15. Right. And then you go up from there. So that's the challenge. I mean, look, we've got a 49% completion rate for Anthony Richardson. So that is a challenge. Overall, the splits don't look that bad. Obviously, you see the targets come down per game with Flacco, 9.3 versus 6.2. That's because the nature of the offense changes when they have Richardson out there. They move more to a run-heavy game. And then they also have several of the dropbacks end up turning into scrambles. You're not getting that with a statue like Flacco out there. So that ultimately ends up hurting the receptions per game once you then combine that with the lower completion rate that you have for Richardson. So yeah, I do think that this is a downgrade for Downs, but to your point, Ian, like he has come through. So we know that the booms are still there. You just got to be willing to live with those absolute busts. When I say bust, I mean, you can get a 0 real easily. You could get a 0 from Josh Downs almost as easily as you could get 20 points.
Chris, further complicating matters is not the world's easiest schedule here rounding out the season. We got the Lions' league best defense in terms of EPA per dropback allowed this season up in week 12, in Foxborough next week, bye week in week 14, and then at the Broncos and versus the Titans in weeks 15 and 16. So you with Dwayne, Chris, Josh Downs, more of a boomer bust wide receiver 3?
Yeah, because you're trying to split hairs as to where a guy like Josh Downs can fit in from a wide receiver standpoint. Now, him running primarily out of the slot does lend itself a bit more to some of those layup targets, but that's where Anthony Richardson has historically struggled. And so while I would say that if you were to compare the 2 wide receivers that Richardson used primarily between Josh Downs and Michael Pittman, most folks would say Downs has outplayed Pittman. He's outscored him in about 6 of their 8 games together, out-targeted him about 5 of those. it still seems like Downs is the more efficient of the two. And given this upcoming matchup against the Lions, I mean, they're one of the highest man coverage rates like in the league. It does allow itself a bit more for Downs, who does have one of the higher yards per route run against man coverage, at least relative to Michael Pittman. So we are splitting hairs, but of course with Anthony Richardson under center, I mean, given his inaccuracy so far as we've seen throughout the season, it makes Downs a bit harder to evaluate from that standpoint. So boom bust, I think that's where we should probably categorize him.
Downs is just outside of our consensus top 25, comes in as the wide receiver 26 combined. Dwain's wide receiver 25, mine wide receiver 27. So again, not saying you can't start the guy, but not someone that needs to be jammed in the lineups of all shapes and sizes by any stretch. But guys, again, had to throw some shade there, but couldn't do that without help from our friends over at Knockaround. If you like these sunglasses or just want to go find some for your own, really do invite you to head to knockaround.com. So many great options, both in terms of regular sunglasses and, of course, their officially licensed NFL collection. Polarized lenses for less than $50 that are high quality for a low price. So can't forget about that UV 400 protection for your eyes. And yeah, overall, I would say the best money that sunglasses can buy. Something like that. So knockaround.com. Check it out, everyone. Don't forget to use code LIFE for free shipping. Fraud check season. Dwain always refuses to call football players frauds because he's a good human being and all that. But we're going to go through some of the biggest performances from last week and try to determine if they're going to keep on persisting moving forward, or maybe if it was more of a one-off blip on the radar. So, Chris, we're going to start with you. Just actually got done talking about the Josh Downs side of things in Indy, but lest we forget, Anthony Richardson coming off a QB2 performance. Do you think he can keep it up ahead of this Week 12 matchup against the Lions?
It's going to be tough. It was encouraging to see how well Anthony Richardson played under center, at least from how well he was able to handle pressure and actually operate as a drop back passer. I mean, a 53.3% success rate when pressured, that's a season high for Richardson. Now, of course, like going up against the Jets, we talked about some of their defensive woes. I mean, that might have helped. In this case, going up against the Lions, I was just talking about their man coverage rates. It might be a bit tougher for receivers like A.D. Mitchell, Alec Pierce, even Michael Pittman and Josh Downs to gain enough separation for Richardson to continue to accruing the passing yards that we need. Hopefully, the rushing portion is still going to be there. One of the highs in terms of design rushing rates and also scrambling for Richardson. So we should at least get the floor performance we would expect out of a hybrid passer like Anthony Richardson. So I'm not really ready to call it a fraud. But again, given the matchups and then also looking at their upcoming schedule, I mean, I'd say at least moving in the right direction. I won't completely count him out just yet.
It was a good reminder that these things can happen because his first 3 full starts of his career, I mean, he finished as exactly the QB4 each and every time. The problem was the next 4, he was just the QB 23, 31, 22, and 24. So again, good reminder, but man, going up against that Lions defense, I know Ben Johnson is always the guy, deservedly so, who we talk about being, the hot head coaching candidate, but don't sleep on Aaron Glenn, potentially, being a hot commodity here once the season's over as well. Dwain, good talk about a running back now. Sean Payton's backfield, kind of giving some fantasy managers some problems. First time we've ever had that happen. Javonte Williams, RB 11 last week, after it seemed like Audric Estime was actually taking over the backfield. What do you make of this situation ahead of Week 12?
Yeah, I don't want really any part of this backfield, at least for my starting lineup. I mean, I'm fine leaving one of these guys on my bench in case, maybe later in the season we get some clarity around this. But yeah, it's a real challenge. And has any running back been more frustrating than Javonte Williams? He is the only running back that couldn't smash the Carolina Panthers. Every other running back rocked that matchup, and Javonte was the one guy that came in under. Then we get the Audric Estime takeover. No, just kidding. Back to Javonte Williams. Once everyone finally puts him on the bench, he had scored 9 points, 10 points, 3 points in the Estime game. Then he pops off for 19 last weekend. Dude doesn't even have 36% of the rushing attempts, and he does this. Why? Because he had a 16% target share. He did score a rushing touchdown as well. So Javonte was efficient on his touches. We didn't really get any sort of clarity either from Sean Payton. If you guys saw the interview with him after the game, he said, I want to continue to get the young guys involved. And he's like, well, and Javonte Williams, he's young, so I mean, I don't really know what that means. I guess he wants to have all 3 of these guys involved. Jaleel McLaughlin's kind of been the odd man out, but we can't trust Peyton, man. We can't trust him. And look, it's working right now. The Broncos are winning. They've got a good defense. Bo Nix is feeling it. So there's not really any sort of pressure for him to try to figure this out. I think he's going to go with a hot hand approach, and that makes it really difficult, Ian, to trust any of these guys. So I won't call it a fraud, but it's a fugazi. It's a fugazi. I'm not going back to the well on Javonte Williams.
We have Bo Nix as a consensus top 8 quarterback this week. Courtland Sutton's in that wide receiver 2 territory where he should be started in far more lineups than not. But otherwise, guys, far too much rotation going on to really be trusting anyone. So not feeling great about Javonte Williams. But Chris, maybe we feel better about Jauan Jennings. Again, some of us here are men of their words, and we actually do have Jauan Jennings ranked ahead of Debo. Others do not. So what do you make of the reigning wide receiver 7, Chris, going into week 12?
That he should have gotten that $30 million contract that Brandon. No, I'm just playing. They paid him well for what he's done historically, but still, the way that Jauan Jennings has operated so far throughout this season, it does really allow allow itself to be that why we got the same contract that we got for Jauan Jennings back in week 3. It was 40% of the team's targets. He's mossing guys, 46.5 PPR points. It's one of the best performances of the season so far. But it made sense with Brandon Ayuk still healthy, Debo still on the field, George Kittle still healthy, that he would start to fade as a wide receiver over the few weeks afterwards. I mean, 23% target share, 13% target share in weeks 4 and 5 after that blow-up game because all the guys were healthy. But now, without Brandon Ayuk in the lineup, and we've seen George Kittle in and out and Debo dealing with that pneumonia, I mean, Jauan Jennings, even after suffering the hip injury, he walked back into a 30% target share in week 10. I think that should have been one of the largest indicators that we were dealing with the wide receiver 1, because that was CMC's first game back, saw Debo out there on the field. Kittle was also out there. And of course, Jauan Jennings has 11 targets in that first game. But it's not just the volume for me, for Jennings. It's also how he's being used on the field. I mean, around 40-50% slot snap rate so far over the past couple of weeks. And that's, again, with CMC out there on the field. And of course, I think we talked about this earlier in the year. Brock Purdy, his average depth of target, his passing ADOT was one of the highest in the league, which made things a bit harder. It were just different in terms of the contrasting styles of how we thought about the 49ers offense, where it was these short, intermediate passes with guys working after the catch. Over the past 4 games for Brock Purdy, 9.3 air yards per target, 7.4, 7, and then 5.5 just this past week. And accordingly, his passing success rate has also started to creep up as well. So if we're seeing Jauan Jennings not just get the target share that would be requisite of a wide receiver 1, but also working in that short to intermediate parts of the field, allowing him to create after the catch, you do have that wide receiver 1 that you would want to have on your roster, where it's got the volume and scheme are also working in his direction. So I'm not calling this a fraud. This is actually legit to me.
I'm with you, Chris. My wide receiver 13 on the week. And yes, we'll still see Debo and Kittle and all these guys get schemed, their targets and all that. But it does really seem like when, we don't see Shanahan get a wide open receiver for Purdy, he is looking Jauan's way. 18 contested targets this season. The rest of the 49ers wide receivers combined only have 23. So truly a great breakout season from Jauan Jennings. And as much as I'd like to, push Dwain's buttons a little bit, he and the rest of the rankers don't have Jauan ranked any lower than wide receiver 20. So get him and get Debo in those starting lineups. Dwain, maybe a bigger question though for Commanders tight end 1, Zach Ertz, the tight end 7 in week 11, facing a nice matchup now against the Cowboys. I mean, Dwain, he only has 0.6 fewer PPR points than Kyle Pitts this season. Could you imagine the hoopla if his name was something like, I don't know, Ben Sinnott?
Yeah, we would be going absolutely nuts, wouldn't we, Hartitz? But it is funny. I mean, we talked about Zach Ertz actually this offseason. We were like, this is going to happen, isn't it? Because we just had to go to the offensive coordinator, right? And we know that this has already happened once before. This happened to Trey McBride back in the day for Cliff Kingsbury, whenever he had Zach Ertz ahead of him. And everybody was mad, but Zach Ertz was doing his thing. And here he is again, holding off the rookie. So maybe that's also a good sign, though, that you don't have to completely bail on Ben Sinnott. He could still end up being a really good tight end, was a good receiving tight end coming out of Kansas State. So I think there's still hope for him. But this year, it's definitely the Zach Ertz show, Ian. And I am buying this. We've been buying it. I think actually he probably holds the record for being in the Sicko Start recommendation the most this year. So many that I just had to bar him from the conversation, but he's still not on people's rosters right now. He's rostered only 33% of time over Yahoo. This guy's a top 12 tight end. I mean, he's got a 19% target share. Listen to these tight end finishes since week 6, 11, 9, 9, a 37. Guys, before you freak out, go look at Tucker Kraft. He's got some 37s, right? He's got some 30s, but everybody loves Tucker Kraft. And then he's got a 21, and then last week a 7. I think the big challenge this weekend is can the Cowboys even challenge the Commanders to need to throw the ball? Like, this is probably a Brian Robinson, 200-yard game. The way the Cowboys looked last weekend, like Robinson is getting health, or maybe Eckler gets in a little bit. Heck, Jeremy McNichols probably goes for 75 and a backup role in this one. But if they do need to throw the ball, obviously we like Ertz. I have him as a low-end tight end 1 this weekend, Ian, and I think that's where he deserves to be the rest of the season.
Dwain and I in agreement. Our tight end 10 ahead of guys like Tucker Kraft, Hunter Henry, Mark Andrews, Jake Ferguson, Dalton Schultz, amongst others. So feeling good about Ertz. And also in huge news, guys, the Zach Ertz they break a tackle Twitter account. We're back at Zach Ertz Yak, devoted to telling you guys if Ertz broke a tackle every single time he catches a pass. Spoiler, the answer is usually no. So it took like a 2-year hiatus. Really fun seeing that pop up. Best account out
I wish
there.
Andrew Luck would play a game so we could get that account back. The old Andrew Luck account.
Oh, man.
That was the best. That was the best. That and the Zach Ertz. Those were prime days of fantasy football.
That's Captain Andrew Luck to you, Dwain McFarland. So,
right.
guys, again, that was our fraud check. Not that these guys are actually frauds, but maybe their production last week could have been a bit more fraudulent than initially seemed. So let's get into some more Week 12 goodness with the Smash Matchups of the Week. Ring that bell, because Dwain, the Lions look like they are once again set up to put up some serious numbers. So I know, everyone, I'm not sitting here saying, oh, do you guys see this Jahmyr Gibbs guy? Like, we got to get him in the lineup. So Amon-Ra St. Brown, like, I understand it. It really comes down to Dwain and whether or not we want to trust Jameson Williams. And against this Colts secondary, man, I do think it's looking that way, whether you want to look at explosive passing or, in this case, combined passing yards per drop back. Really seeing the Lions almost in an entire tier of their own relative to the other passing games throughout the league.
Yeah, there's also other really interesting stat just known as passing yards given up per game, and it's the third best on the slate. It's so funny. We jump through all these hoops, and these things are awesome, guys. I'm kidding. We love looking at all the advanced data points, but most of the time they actually just point to the raw numbers that we see. There are times that it helps us see that the raw numbers are wrong. This is one of those situations where literally just everything lines up. Though we do have a great matchup for JMO. We had a great matchup last weekend. He really did come through. We've got Sam Laporta still on the injury report, so if he misses another game, we're really looking at a consolidated attack with just him and the Sun God. I would throw out the name, though, of David Montgomery. I know everybody's starting Jahmyr Gibbs because they drafted him high, but David Montgomery is one of these guys that he can be a ebb and flow a little bit more even than Jahmyr Gibbs, but man, it's an absolute smash matchup for him as well, Ian. So Monty this week, I think he's a borderline running back 1 with all of these bye weeks that we've got going on. And then you've got the juicy matchup here against the Colts, giving up 143 yards per game on the ground. These rushing numbers allowed this season are kind of amazing to me. Like sometimes I'm like, am I looking at the passing column or am I looking at the rushing column? And that's the 4th most on this slate this weekend. Only 3 teams giving up more rushing yards per game than the Colts. So yeah, obviously you're starting Gibbs, but man, Monty right there in that running back 1 conversation as well this week.
And it's not as much of this, okay, Montgomery's their inside the tackles grinder and Gibbs is the, explosive pass catching back. Yes, they can both do that, but we actually have Montgomery out targeting Gibbs over the course of these past 3 weeks, which, I don't know, we all saw that check down that Gibbs took 55 yards and nearly broke to the house. I'm not saying they should be doing that, but hey, points are points and the Lions are certainly scoring plenty of them. So, Chris, again, last point on Jameson Williams. He's my wide receiver 19, Dwayne's wide receiver 17. However, Freeman and Charts do have him closer to that wide receiver 2 borderline. And I understand it in terms of, no, we probably can't project him for more than 5 or 6 targets. But if we're going to kind of, go out on a limb for someone with that little targets, might as well be someone in this offense and again in this matchup.
Yeah, 100%. And I thought it was great to see him coming back from the 2-game suspension in week 10 and walking into around a 22% target share. And that was in the first game back. Now, we hoped that with Sam Laporta out last week, we would see a few more targets funneled towards Jameson Williams. But instead, Jared Goff decided to throw the ball to Brock Wright a bit more. So either way, seeing him involved as the wide receiver 2, as we've seen throughout the season, does lend itself a bit more to Jameson Williams being in our lineup. Wide receiver 2 with wide receiver 1 upside is what I would categorize him. And just a quick note on the Sun guy. I've always thought of, from an archetype standpoint, he would be one of those juiced up slot receivers, and that's the way he's been used so far. Did you guys know he's second in contested catch rate for wide receivers with more than a 20+% target share? I just don't think about him like in that fashion, but the way that he's been able to not just earn targets, but also be one of the more physical wide receivers in the league so far, we really are seeing the Sun God really start to, lean into the name a bit more.
Absolute baller. I know last year, I'm pulling up numbers right now, but the whole like him being restricted to only the slot thing hasn't exactly held up. And yeah, I'm looking at it right now this year, guys. 314 snaps out wide, 246 in the slot. So yeah, that's a lot, but he's far from the slot merchant that some people, aka George Pickens, have made him out to be. Gonna stick with the combined pass yards per dropback. And again, all we're doing with these stats, trying to make one-way metrics instead of always going the offense ranks X and the defense ranks Y. But accordingly, Dwain, Chargers passing game really set up well because, one, they've been balling. Justin Herbert and company, 9th highest dropback rate over expected since their bye. I think they were 25th before so. And also, this Ravens secondary hasn't been able to cover anyone all season long. So from Ladd McConkey to Will Dissly to Justin Herbert, hell, even Quentin Johnston, Dwain, good time to get these guys in starting lineups.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give away everything for tomorrow's show when we talk about the rankings, upgrades, and downgrades. But you guys have probably caught a theme here from me and Hartitz over the last 3 to 4 weeks. If they're playing against the Ravens and they're a pass catcher, we're probably moving them up the ranks. And it's really one of these perfect situations because not only are they giving up the most passing yards per game this season at 305, guys, a Ravens defense giving up 305 per game. So all those things align up with all the things that Ian's already telling you here with the advanced data points. They also are really good at stopping the run. So they create a funnel to the passing game where teams don't really want to try to run the ball against them as much, only giving up 78 yards per game on the ground, which is one of the toughest in the league. So you get that combination of things, and we have seen with the Chargers, Ian, over the last 5 weeks, much more willing to drop back and throw the ball when they need to. I think this is going to be one of the games where they will need to because we know that the Ravens have an explosive offense and that defense against the run that we just talked about. So I think that means more work for McConkey, more work for Will Dissly, more work for Quentin Johnston. I think they are all very viable. They've all moved up quite a bit the ranks. I've got Dissly in my tight end 1 conversation. McConkey, borderline wide receiver 1. I would say mid-range wide receiver 2 at worst. And then Quentin Johnston is in that wide receiver 3 category. But man, he could put up a wide receiver 1 performance if he catches a couple of long ones in this one, and there's a really good chance of that with how well Herbert is playing in this matchup.
And remember, QJ had that touchdown last week, but also led the week in unrealized air yards, certainly getting plenty of fantasy-friendly downfield targets. Chris, would you rather start Ladd McConkey or any wide receiver on the Cleveland Browns?
Well, give me Ladd McConkey, just the guy that's playing with a quarterback that's honestly playing lights out. And to Dwayne's point, if you check out the dropback over expectation rate for the Chargers, and that's available over on fantasylife.com in the utilization report section, team styles part, over the last 7 games, 5 of them have been at or above their expectation rate. That's compared to the earlier parts of the season where it was kind of sliding into them being more of a run-first offense like we thought the Chargers was going to be. But seeing Herbert not just sling the ball out there, but also getting guys that we thought we didn't really have too much confidence in. I mean, I love it, guys. All the Will Dissly love, after all the slander y'all gave me over the summertime, to see Will Dissly now be in the top 12 right. I knew, never wrong, just early. But of course, going up against the Ravens, the last 7 games, 5 of the last 7 games, we've seen quarterbacks go up against them and throw for multiple touchdowns. I mean, Joe Burrow tagged them for a total combined 9 touchdowns against them. Didn't result in a win. I'm not bitter about that at all. But with Bo Nix and Russell Wilson being the only 2 quarterbacks so far of the last 8 games to not throw for multiple touchdowns against them, they're facing Justin Herbert. We need to get all the Chargers wide receivers or just pass catchers in general in our lineups.
I honestly forgot about the Will Dissly call. We have to give you major props on that, Chris.
I did.
We do. I forgot about it. Now, I will say, I can't believe this man has a 25% targets per route run.
It's crazy.
Where is that coming from?
This.
But hey, it's good, and we will take it, and they are definitely vibing. Him and Justin Herbert, they got a thing going.
I gave my public apology to Chris on a Monday, Dwain. So good to see you're finally catching up. Chris, I look forward to issuing, my private apology to you at a later time. So Dwain does have Disley, tight end 9 on the week. I'm just a little bit lower at tight end 13. But yeah, guys, in terms of that, Zach Ertz, Tucker Kraft, Hunter Henry, Dallas Goedert tier firmly in it. What a time to be alive. So again, those are some of the better passing game matchups of the week. But now I want to take a look at some explosive run rates, because this New York Giants defense, as much as they do have some dogs in that defensive line, haven't exactly been great at stopping the run this year. And meanwhile, Dwain, both Rachaad White and Bucky Irving have really been staples inside the top 24 now for a good month.
Yeah, and I mean, in this one, I really like the matchup on the ground here. Obviously, Rachaad White doing his thing, but Bucky Irving, he has been the leading rusher pretty much, well, actually every game since week 7. And over the last 2 games, 44% and 50% of the carries. We've got a really good matchup here against the Giants. You've given all the advanced data points, and those actually line up really well with just the normal data points. 147 yards per game allowed on the ground by the Giants. That's the second most on the week 12 slate. So this is an absolute smash matchup. You've also got the Bucs as 6-point favorites, so that can lead to even more rushing attempts. So yeah, both of these guys get a big bump up the ranks this week. I'm riding them up today in my rankings risers. We're going to figure out how to get creative tomorrow and how we talk about these players, because we're going to be talking about several of the same guys.
Shout out to our YouTube fan, but we have all these charts that we are referencing up right now. You can also find them in my manifesto article or on my Twitter account. But blue is good, red is bad. And accordingly, guys, yeah, got Tampa Bay run game right up there with the Ravens, and then also the Titans and Steelers as some of the best setup matchups of the week. So, Dwain, again, it's one of those things where I know for a little bit it seemed like that we'd have Sean Tucker going in there, but Chris, certainly seems like in recent weeks more of a 2 RB backfield, which, hey, in 2024, we can get down with.
Yeah, and I've noticed a couple of beat reporters asking about the lack of Sean Tucker's involvement after the early parts of the season, seeming like this would turn into one of the dreaded 3-headed monsters. But at least if we're seeing just the targets or the opportunities condense around Rachaad White and Bucky Irving, it should lend itself to we should continue to start them. My only concern, though, even going up against the Giants right now, who are just below the league average in zone coverage rate, which would lend itself to pass-catching running backs. I mean, over the past few weeks, we saw Chuba Hubbard mix in for about four catches for 16 yards. Austin Eckler got in for 3 for 41 as a receiver. Even the Steelers running backs, they combined for 30 yards off of 5 catches. So we can see a potential area for a guy like Rachaad White, who has been a higher target earner compared to Bucky Irving over their last 4 to 5 games or so. But my concern is, does the offensive shift if we get Mike Evans back in this game? That hasn't been confirmed yet, and we'll see about the practice reports and what his outlook is going to be for this week in week 12. But in that first game that we saw against the Bucs against the Chiefs, without Evans and Godwin on the field, the Bucs offense actually completely shifted to highlighting their running backs and tight ends. Over 50% of Baker Mayfield's targets went to those 2 positions because all the rest of the guys were hurt. And with most of the wide receivers, their hamstrings being made out of silly string, it doesn't lend itself, or they haven't been available for Baker Mayfield. So if we do get Evans back, we do see a bit more out of whether it's Trey Palmer, Jalen McMillan, or those guys. Do we see fewer targets for the running backs moving forward, which is a question we won't know until we see it happen on the field.
Again, keep an eye on that injury report for the potential return of Mike Evans. Would be nice to see him with that chase to 1K get it done, but yeah, certainly would take away some targets from these RBs as well as Cade Otton. But hey, at least the matchup this week, good enough for them to probably make the most of their opportunities, however many that might be. Let's talk about another running back, James Conner, someone who has looked fantastic out there. I mean, you look at any advanced kind of rushing stat, and I'm sure traditional ones as well, you'll see him near the top of the leaderboard, but maybe hasn't scored as many touchdowns as we expected. Maybe that changes, Dwain, against a Seahawks defense that earlier this year, not earlier this season, he torched for 204 total yards. Do you see a repeat performance happening with a well-rested Cardinals team coming off their bye?
Yeah, coming off the bye, we've got 6 other teams on bye, so that's also a factor here. And then you've got the matchup that we just talked about. You've got the Seahawks giving up 126 yards per game on the ground to the opposing running back position. 15.7 points right now is what we've got James Conner projected for over at the Fantasy Life projections. That's one of the top numbers on the week. I've got him as my running back 11, so I'm a little bit lower than the projections, which I mean, I make the projections, but rankings and projections, we're thinking of ceilings and floors and all these things. So they're not always exactly hand in hand, but they're generally, they're very aligned. So in the top 12 for me this week, I think there's a lot of things to like about James Conner. There shouldn't be a fantasy lineup that we can find out there where he's not in the starting lineup. If you guys have that one and you actually do have that close call, make sure you send me a screenshot of it, or, you can hit me up over in Discord on Friday, or you can get Ian on Thursday and you can hit us with those start sit questions.
Dwayne's like that SpongeBob meme where he's like got the detective outfit on. He sees the, wanted poster for himself, projections and rankings going together. Figure it out, Dwayne. So James Conner, again, someone who's going to be in most lineups, but again, just more so wanted to point out the potential boom upside. And hey, if you guys are like me and enjoy hopefully winning a few dollars on anytime touchdowns or those, ladder sorts of bets on the weekend, James Conner would certainly be one of my preferred picks. But Chris, want to go with someone who might be a bit of a tougher start for people, and that is Bo Nix. Certainly had a great season and now has a great matchup as well against the Raiders and stands out as potentially having one of the cleanest, just pockets of the week in terms of combined pressure rates. Do you think that good times can keep on rolling for Nix coming off probably the single most impressive performance of his young career?
I don't see why not. This will be their actual divisional matchup going up against the Raiders. And when they played him, when was that? Back in week 4, 5, somewhere in there. He put up 20 plus points against the Raiders earlier this season. That was combined with the passing yardage, like over 200 passing yards, but of course the rushing. And that's what we like to see. And for the Raiders, going up against the Raiders specifically, even if they were able to generate pressure, and we've seen Bo Nix have one of the higher scrambling rates. Like when he has been pressured, he's 8th among active starters in scramble rate when placed under duress. And so and also on top of that, like when he does get moving, he's out there on the field, like running around. He's one of 4 quarterbacks with double-digit rushing first downs if pressure. That's him. It's Jaden Daniels, Brock Purdy, and Jalen Hurts on that list in terms of 10-plus rushing touchdowns, like when scrambling. So over the last 6 games, it's just been Matthew Stafford and Justin Fields all the way back in, I think it was week 5 or week 6, are the only passers over the last 6 games going up against the Raiders that haven't thrown for multiple touchdowns. So if we know Bo Nix has the floor case, with the rushing, and also the ceiling case, with from a passing standpoint, whether it's Cortland Sutton getting in there or whichever the wide receiver twos he wants to target, because it's been 8, 9, or 10 pass catchers that have gotten involved over the past 4 weeks, from Troy Franklin all the way to Lil Jordan Humphrey. And any one of those guys at any point can wind up popping off. So with the number of pass catchers he has and also the rushing floor, Bo Nix, QB1, completely makes sense to me.
Dwayne, I still enjoy your note that, it's more like big Lil Jordan Humphrey with, seeing him out there on the field. But hey, man, again, haven't had consistent production really anyone other than Sutton, but Nix is also included there, 9th this season in terms of fantasy points per game, one of only 8 quarterbacks with at least 50 fantasy points from rushing. Yet, Dwayne, you have the audacity to rank him as low as QB9 this week. I guess you're not a believer, man.
I think QB9 is pretty fair. Let's talk about a guy that, where was he 5 weeks ago in our ranks? Like QB 25 to now consistently be right there in the low end QB1 conversation. I think Bo Nix is an incredible story this year. And me having him QB9, I think speaks to that. I think you could push him as high as QB6, maybe even QB5 this week. He's definitely in a tier of guys right there. He ranks 7th right now in design rushing attempts for his team as a percentage. And then he ranks 7th also in scramble rate. So we know he's going to get it done on the ground. And now we've seen in 2 out of the last 4 games, he's got that big boom upside in the passing game as well. So the Raiders are definitely one of these teams that I don't know how much they can push the Broncos, that they're susceptible to give up a big game. That mostly they're giving up 200 yards passing per game, but a lot of it comes down to teams don't need to throw the ball against them. If they needed to, they would be torching this defense. So yeah, I do like Bo Nix, and I get it. I'm not as high as Ian on him this week, but I'm saying that you're starting him in most leagues. So that's where we're at.
I'm QB6, so we're not exactly in different stratospheres, but yeah, Bo Nix, Bo Levers here on the Fantasy Life Show. Last one, guys, want to be looking at some yards before contact, because Lord knows it's easier to pick up a lot of rushing yards if you're not even getting touched before you're a few yards down the field. And Brian Robinson, man, really standing out. I know Dwayne's been in a situation where, as a long time just sad, pained, depressed Cowboys fan, you've had to watch a lot of running backs just have field days against this defense, and sure seems like Brian Robinson could be ready to join that group.
Yeah, and the big thing is we just need Brian Robinson healthy. We know the matchup is a smash. The Cowboys can't stop anyone. Mozzie Smith hasn't got out of his snap since the first game. He hasn't gotten out of his stance yet from his first start in the NFL. He's still sitting out there waiting to get out of his stance. They don't have anyone in the middle of the defense. Like, look, Eric Kendricks is playing like admirably. But I mean, he's not what he once was in Minnesota. He fits the scheme for Mike Zimmer, but they are really struggling to stop the run. This team is designed to get into shootouts, get a lead, and then rush the passer with Micah Parsons. Those game scripts are not playing out the way they want them to, and that's a real challenge. So Brian Robinson Jr., last 2 games, Ian, 64% and 67% of the team's rushing attempts. The 2 games he started, that's week 8 and week 11. If he gets anywhere close to that, if he gets 65% of the rushing attempts this weekend for the Commanders, he's going for $150 and 2 touchdowns. Maybe a little bit of foreshadowing here again for our show tomorrow. I have no clue what we're talking about tomorrow, guys, because we're hitting all the home runs right here.
Dwain has Brian Robinson ranked ahead of guys like Ramondre Stevenson, Najee Harris, J.K. Dobbins, Aaron Jones, Chuba Hubbard, amongst others. So, yeah, feeling really good here. And it was also just good to see in that last Thursday night game fully back to his usual workload, because I think we had that game earlier this year against the Cardinals where coming back from injury was still a little bit limited. Seems like all systems are a go for B-Rob. So, great stuff there, guys. And again, invite you all to check out all of these sort of matchup-related charts and notes in my manifesto article for free over at fantasylife.com. But now let's get into some streamer tight end questions, because as we know, 6 teams on bye right now. I'm going to have 6 more ahead of us in week 14. So, Dwain, looking at some of the top options for the next few weeks, talk about Jonnu Smith, someone who has ripped off multiple top 3 performances since the Dolphins returned from their bye.
Yeah, I mean, the Dolphins' offense has really turned from being just centered around Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle to being around Tyreek Hill, Jonnu Smith, Devon Achane, and then Jalen Waddle. Jalen Waddle's the guy definitely that's been left out here lately. That could change, at some point in the season. You can see these things kind of rotate around as defenses start to change their game plan. They might decide, we might want to cover this Jonnu Smith guy. But right now, Jonnu's on an absolute heater. You talked about it, Ian. If you look at his route participation over the last 4 games, 76%. The number we look for tight ends to get to is at least 70. 80%, right, is where you really get into that range where you're starting to move into every week starter. But look, it's the Dolphins offense. You got Tua back under center. So he's averaging 12.8 fantasy points per game. Obviously a big help last week, blowing up for 28. So yeah, a lot of upside here. I also do, to your point, Ian, like the schedule over the next 4 games for Mr. Jonnu Smith. So I think he's a low-end tight end 1 for that stretch. He might finish outside the top 12, but he also gives you the upside to finish, as the top 3 in any one of these weeks, because we know that the Dolphins offense can get hot with Tua.
Consensus tight end 7 for us this week. And yeah, facing a Patriots defense, just got flamed by Matthew Stafford. And then in week 14, if that's when you need a tight end, facing this Jets defense that we've already talked about, not exactly being the same beast lately. Chris, I'd be remiss if I did not set you up for our next one. Will Dissly, you've been here since day one. Go off for, again, someone who we pretty much consensually have as a top 10 option in week 12.
I mean, I tried to tell you guys over the summertime, there were dozens of us talking about Will Dissly and his potential as a top 12. Dozens of us. But no, 35% of the targets, 17% just this past week. I mean, the target share is there, and we gave all the flowers to Justin Herbert and that pass game so far. And going up against the Ravens secondary shouldn't be too much of a test given the number of quarterbacks that have been able to dunk on them so far. So from Will Dissly, if you picked him up, you have him in your lineup, he's the guy that you would want. I mean, look at this. I mean, 13.9 points per game allowed to the tight end position, 24th. And the run out over the next few weeks also give you the confidence that you would want to start him. So without Hayden Hurst in the lineup, so also seeing some of the pass catching. Ladd McConkey also got injured just this past Sunday night. So potentially more targets coming his way and the matchups to really give you that confidence to start him. Will Dissly, tight end 1, you're going to hear first, but over the summertime, not just here on this show today.
Dissly still only rostered in 13.9% of ESPN leagues. Jonnu Smith's at 31.7%. As Dwain mentioned earlier, you can also still find Zach Ertz in more leagues than not. That said, Dwain, I know we're in a handful of, as you like to call them, skank leagues where it's a lot harder to find options like this. So what do you think about going way down the ranks to potentially targeting Theo Johnson, Giants tight end 1, ahead of what could be, again, a winnable matchup for this Giants offense?
Yeah, look, he's essentially been the Giants' starting tight end for the last 2 months, but now he's starting to earn targets, starting to get more involved in the offense. We'll see if that continues. You got a quarterback change going on here. He's got a 17% target share over the last 3 games, Ian. So, yeah, I think if you're playing now, we do have to clarify, you need to be in a skank league, guys. I know Ian wants me to say that. I'm contractually obligated to say skank league at least 3 times in this podcast. Or in this show, I do believe. So, yeah, there's 2. I've hit it twice. But, yeah, looking at him, he is a guy that could give you a tight end 1 finish. You know, the underlying data points are all right there. And then if you look at the matchups, they are very good. You get the Bucs. The big one, the Bucs this weekend, if you're looking at the streamer, they're the 29th defense against opposing tight ends.
He's a freaky athlete. Had, just a situation, to Dwain's point, where he has been on the field full time, 77% route rates, same ballpark as guys like George Kittle and Brock Bowers, so we don't exactly need more routes. And yeah, Buccaneers defense, guys, they've allowed 36, 27, 41, 31, 30, and 23 points in their last 6 games. So checking a lot of boxes and only rostered in about 2% of ESPN leagues. So if you are in some of those skank leagues, go ahead and take a long look at Theo Johnson. But guys, that is going to wrap up this edition of the Fantasy Life Show. We'll be back tomorrow with Dwain having to grind out what to talk about in our upgrades, downgrades, sicko starts, and of course, Matthew Friedman's favorites. So we'll see you guys then. But until then, for Dwain, for Chris, for producer Matt, for producer Kelsey, I'm Ian. Thanks again for tuning into the Fantasy Life Show. And until next time, take care, everybody.